Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our next session with Andrea Günter, a researcher at the University of Freiburg, Germany. And her presentation today is very interesting. She starts with Aristotle's concept of justice and reconstructs it to look at a possible feminist theory of money. So please welcome our guest, Andrea Günter. Welcome, Andrea. The floor is yours.
Thank you. My paper will have two main points. According to our conference subject, the first main point will be why a feminist theory of money, defining the future of justice. And the second main point will be why a feminist theory of money, rethinking Aristotle's concept of justice. Why a feminist theory of money? People's lives are regulated more and more by money economy. The financial market is one of the largest sectors in global times producing injustice. A feminist critique of the phenomenon of money becomes more and more important. The main reason is, if money is not neutral, as the new classical economics says, if it is based on social relations, then it is based on gender relations. And this is the main reason why we have to look on money concepts. Because of these reasons, the Swiss feminist economist Mascha Madöring calls for this project. We need a feminist theory of money. A feminist critique of economics must include a feminist theory of money necessarily. Because of all economical, political developments, the humanities and social sciences are increasingly grappling with the phenomenon of money. In between, we have three very important publications who try to reconstruct what money is, but not in a context of the classical economical discourse, but more in a philosophical discourse. And for me, it's interesting to follow or pick up some of their arguments and give them a feminist profile. So, why a feminist theory of money intellectual starting point? The other one was more a historical starting point. Money is not a neutral intermedium. There is no such neutral thing. Money consists in material and political substances. That money is not neutral can be observed in its effects. Money produces paradoxes. Feminist money theory can identify such paradoxes and use them for reconstructing the phenomenon of money. And for me, one of this important paradoxes is the following. The unexplained feminist paradox of the cultural money economy is the structural difference between money and the fact that women are not paid equal wages for equal work. The difference between the work and the wages of women show not only the patriarchal structure of gender relations in the economical sphere, but over more that these relations are inscribed in the phenomenon of money. And this is the background, the view in which I try to reconstruct the very old theory of money that Aristotle represents. With this short points, I have three different views on the interrelatedness between money and women. First, we can look from gender division of work to the distribution of wages. This is a normal viewpoint we have. You know all the slogan, the same wages, or the political idea, the same wages for the same work. Second, and a necessarily additional view is looking from the gender bias of money concepts for creating a new connection between work and wages. And in my paper, I will force this perspective. The third point is that at the same time, we always have to do with changes, also with changes in the practices of money and in the money concepts. Therefore, it is necessary to identify and describe how the economic changes in gender relations are influencing what money is. This will be the third point. For this, I can give you only some short remarks, because the 20 minutes are not long enough to really explore this ausführlich. Yes. Unpaid female work goes to be transformed more and more into direct wage relations. It becomes connected to rates of return. More and more women have own bank accounts. Daily money transfers are more and more organized by bank systems, and so on and so on. And this historical change, who are related to the transformation of gender relations, are influencing what money is. And if I'm following the discourse in philosophy about money, then there's a discussion that in between we have a transformation of debt and guilt system of money to a credit system. And this is, in my opinion, connected to the change of gender relations. And I think it's helpful to be aware of this change, because when we activize and use this transformation, then we can discuss the politics of money in its moment that shows what societies are promising of women activities. Credit systems speak about the promises of human activities. And it's in the economical sphere, it is helpful to understand how credit systems and women are connected, to understand, as one sphere, what economics is promising our society, and our society is promising in form of credits, what women will become. Such developments change the meaning and the structure of money and its system. And it could change female money power if we are aware of it and use it. With this remarks, I change to my second point. Why a new theory of money, rethinking the past of justice? For pointing out the structure of between money and gender relations, it is worth taking a look at Aristotle's fifth book of the Nicomachean Ethics about justice. I don't know if you're aware of it, but in this book there are some more or less important remarks on the connection between money and justice, and it makes sense to reconstruct this connection and to understand what it can have to do with gender relations. To make this as a structure is helpful because it is a very important background for the ideas of economics founded in modernity. I will remember you to Marx's concept of exploitation of capitalism, but although, and for me, this is also a very important.
You're fading.
Sorry?
Please come back. You're fading. Come back to your microphone, please.
Okay. And for me, another text is very important, and it is Jane Austen's Writing Persuasion, because we can read it as a philosophical, political allegorization of the Aristotelian patriarchal family in the house policy system, figurating the systemic failure of the patriarchal domestic system and its politics and economical impacts. And if you put this together, then you have a background to reread Aristoteles. And we have a theory, or a model that allows us to draw a connection between patriarchy, money, and capitalism before the historical phenomenon of capitalism really arises. And in between, my idea on this complex is that one can restructure better why it is a patriarchal money system that causes that money systems explodes or implodes. So now to Aristoteles. Aristoteles inscribes the lot servant, man, woman, house policy dualism not only in the Occidental political theory, but also in the concept of ethics and justice. For example, by distinguishing domestical and political justice, and by fostering anthrocentric examples in his justice discourse. Concurrently, and this is my main point today, Aristoteles connects justice to money as the ideal intermediate equal, which is the closer connection between the house policy and the function of money, you can ask. For this, we have to regard economics is present in two ways: the distinction of justice concepts and as a medium for practicing justice. We can ask, how are these two economical functions are connected? Especially, how is money as an intermediate equal connected with the patriarchal structure of the house policy dualism? Now, more concrete to Aristoteles and what he says about money. Aristoteles emphasizes the etymological connection between the Greek nomisma, money, and nomos, the law. Following this etymological derivation, he emphasizes that justice is at work in money. If we regard this point very concrete, then we can see an interdependence between money and justice. Money has a justice, but also justice has money character. So I gave you a first quote where Aristoteles is weighing this. And the important point is that he says money is related to law and justice because it exists not by nature, but by law. And it is in our power, and this is very important, to change it and make it useless. That means that Aristoteles has clear that money is not an idea, it's a concrete practice, and it's depending on the ideas of women, of human beings, and their ideas about justice. The alliance between money and law and justice consists in actively founding an intermediate equal for creating an exchange and finding a just balance. A balance which is, in the words of Aristoteles, equal, intermediate, and relative at the same time. This is a very interesting figure. I can't speak a lot now, not so much of this figure, but I use it in the next argumentations. As a medium and agent for justice, money allows and needs reciprocity. This is the next point of Aristoteles. For this, I will give you the first quote. For if men did not need one another's goods at all, or did not need them equally, they would be either no exchange or no, not the same exchange. That it means that the intersubjective need between individual men of reciprocity is a condition for the same exchange and for applying an intermediate equal like money. So, and if you have this idea of money, you can ask a lot about the connection between money and gender relations. And I will start to give you some interpretations I found of this idea of money. Just first, two quotes. Here we find that money represents human demands, including the demand of having an intermediate equal, of having relatedness and activities for defining the equal as an expression of reciprocity. With this definition, we can fix 2 points. First, money is a social political entity, an intersubjective convention. And if this is true, if it is a social political entity, money represents gender relations. Now, when we want to feel this more concrete, then we can say money reproduces and establishes social political gender structures. And in gender structures are represented in money and its implementation. The third thing we can conclude is observable and coming money relations must be understood and assessed as expression of the demand for reciprocity, for demand for an intermediate equal, for justice, and so on. And this will be the focus and the criteria we can use to understand what money is and can use to distinguish between different money systems. First point. Second point, money reciprocity and gender relations. For this I take the fourth quote. For if men did not need one another's good, and so on. If you rethink what does men say at this point? It is neutral or it is not neutral. For understanding if there is a gender idea in this statement, we can make the experience to substitute men with women. If I'm formulating, for if women did not need one another's goods at all, or did not need them equally, there would be either no exchange, not the same exchange. At that point, we have to ask, who is another one? Are the other ones women? Are there men? Are there all? And if you fill this statement historically and have in mind that Aristotle at the same time represents the house policy and women dualism, then we will have a clear answer to these questions.
Excuse me, we have your 10 minutes now. Okay, you asked to be notified 10 minutes until the end of our session. Thank you. Continue.
Yes, I fix this slide and I think the intention of my explanations are clear. If you take into account the patriarchal structure in which Aristotle is speaking, then I draw the conclusion, women do not need men's good at all, do not have the same needs, also not the same needs of exchange. They cannot have reciprocity. And if you go on with such research, then the next step will be what is an intermediate equal. And there's a very other interesting point in Aristotle's text, because Aristotle combines the intermediate equal with land, food, money, and shoes. That means if you take money in this line, then it is visible how material it is. And if you take food, it becomes visible that the intermediate equal is dependent on the domestic sphere. That means that we have a distinction between domestical and political justice in Aristotle's writing, and at the same time, we have the intermediate equal that is dependent on the domestic sphere. And what does this mean for gender? So gender relation, money and justice on one hand. On the other hand, and this is my very point, and with this point I will close my speech, it shows that even in the idea of political justice, of the reciprocity of men, there's a moment of non-reciprocity. And this is a reciprocity to the domestic sphere. Reconstructing money and justice at that point means that we have to look on the complexity of reciprocity that money in reality represents. And we have to consider the double structure of reciprocity that is being practiced in money and in justice concepts. It's a critic on money concepts and justice concepts at one and the same time. And with this point, I will close my speech. Thank you for listening.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to introduce Clara Carus from Ruth Hagengruber's Institute, the Center for the Center for History of Women Philosophers and Scientists here at Paderborn University, where we are meeting. Clara did a 2-year postdoc at Harvard, and now she's assistant professor here at Paderborn. Please welcome Clara Carus, who will be speaking on Émilie du Châtelet's views on space and time.
Hi. So I've prepared some slides. Can you see them? Okay. And can you see only the slides, or can you see my okay, perfect. Yeah, so my talk is on Émilie du Châtelet and her newfound epistemological approach to the ideas of space and time. And so this is the structure of my presentation. I'll first go through some preliminary remarks, and then I'm going to say a little bit about the context of the debate on time and space in the early modern era, and most important, Newton's assertion of absolute space and time in his mathematical philosophy of nature, and then Leibniz's assertion of relative time and space in his philosophy of religion, because this is the most important context for Du Châtelet. I needed as a backdrop to kind of show why her approach to space and time is so novel. Then I'm going to move to Émilie du Châtelet's newfound approach to time and space, and I'm going to present her analysis of the idea of time and space and the investigation into the formation of the ideas of time and space. This is used in equivalent terms. So the analysis of these ideas, or the investigation into how these ideas are formed, it's pretty much the same. But she names it at some point analysis of ideas, and then in another context, the investigation into the formation of the idea. And then I'm going to take you through some points, what she says about the formation of our idea of space, just for you to get an idea of how this works. And then I've got some concluding remarks. And so my main focus is that I really want to show you that she establishes an entirely new way of thinking about space and time. So to me, it's not so much about what she actually says space is and time is. I really want you to see that she's developing a new way to think about space and time. And I think that she employs this method in other contexts as well, but it's most clear in the case of space and time. And it's really interesting because she's got such an original epistemological way of looking at these things. And it's really novel in this era. And this is why it's so interesting. And it's almost like not researched at all. So my focus is on the premises for establishing arguments on space and time. And I think that she's very different in this sense to all her predecessors, to Newton, Leibniz, Wolff, and so on. So she's really got this new method. And what I think this is she's looking at the constitution of the ideas of time and space through mind as a faculty in relation to what calls real beings and what's later known also as sense beings or real beings. So I'm moving to Newton's assertion of absolute time and space in his mathematical philosophy of nature. So we're in this historical context. Before Newton, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about where Newton is coming from. And Du Châtelet translated Newton's Principia into French. It's still the translation we use. So she knew Newton really well. And before Newton, the movement of one body could only be expressed in relationship to the rest or movement of another body. So movement could really only be expressed in relationship of bodies. And Newton's aim in his Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, is to develop an absolute expression of movement, i.e. the movement of bodies and matter, of course, as just the formula of movement per se for physics. And so this would have the advantage that we don't need to express movement in relationship to one specific singular body, but we can have a formula for movement per se, i.e. like absolute movement. And he wanted to find a mathematical formula in which movement could be expressed absolutely, i.e. without having to refer to other bodies. And this is really what made Newton's work groundbreaking for physics. So Newton distinguishes between relative and absolute space and time. And it serves this aim of expressing absolute movement. And he says that there is relative space and time. So although Newton is known for this absolute space claim or absolute time claim, he didn't say that that space and time are not also relative to sensual beings. But he said that by means of the senses, we only have this relative notion of space and time. But on the basis of mathematical principles, we can also conceive of space and time as absolute. So we can sort of transcend these shapes and that we see in relationship to sensual things. And on the basis of mathematical principles, we can abstract from them and conceive of space and time as something absolute. And with this absolute notion of space and time, on the basis of mathematical principles, we can establish absolute motion and movement. So this is really why Newton needed absolute space and absolute time. It's because it was the way to get to an absolute expression of movement independently of specific bodies. And so Newton does not say much about the ontological status of absolute space and time based on mathematical principles. He makes clear that absolute space and time are not substances, and that they are not attributes, but he does not say how we have to think about their beingness or their reality, i.e. what space and time are themselves. There are some clues. So Newton says, for example, that absolute space and time are immense and that they have to be represented as flowing out of God. But it's not central to him what absolute space and absolute time are in themselves. He needs it on the basis of mathematical principles to establish absolute movement. And it's only ever really thematized in relationship to an understanding of God. Obviously, because otherwise it would have maybe got him into trouble at the time. So, but this is really a sideline for Newton. And so Leibniz is sort of on the other side. So we're moving to the other camp. Leibniz's assertion of the relativity of time and space in his philosophy of religion. So time and space are most comprehensively discussed by Leibniz in his letter correspondence with Newtonian and theologian Samuel Clarke. And these letters are passed on by Caroline, Princess of Wales, and she later became Queen of Britain and Ireland. And in the opening paragraphs of his first letter, Leibniz complains about the development of natural religion in England. And in his first sentence, he criticizes that in England, many turn souls into bodies, and others turn God himself into a bodily entity. And the latter critique is directly addressed at Newton, the former at Locke, but because Newton compared absolute space to a sensorium of God, and Leibniz criticized this. And Leibniz goes on to argue against Newton's notion of absolute space and time, which Newton had established on the basis of mathematical principles in order to be able to express absolute motion. And he argues that time and space are not merely relative if conceived of in relationship to sensual things, but that they are relative beings per se and must not be represented as absolute. So Leibniz's claim is, no, we cannot conceive of space and time as absolute because we run into trouble. So what are his arguments? Leibniz really has a long historical tradition on his side. So time and space are traditionally conceived of as relative to some form of real beings. So I'm just going to rush through this really, but there are Leibniz arguments are roughly based on two different premises. And the first premise is what I call the godlike premise. And so he argues that if space and time were absolute, they would just be like God or like certain attributes of God. So if space is something absolute, then it has to be conceived of as a being that really is eternal and that really is immense and without boundaries and stuff like that. And he says these attributes, they cannot be attributed to space, because then space would really be like God. And that cannot be. And he also puts in, God cannot be spatial or temporal, because if he was, he could only also be divided, etc. And the conclusion is space and time cannot be considered to be absolute. And then, i.e. independent of real beings and be something sort of in themselves, a substance or whatever. And then the second argument is based on the principle of sufficient reason, which Leibniz calls a metaphysical principle. And it's what I call the God's creation premise. So the position is everything must have a reason. That's just what Leibniz establishes. And even God has to have a reason for everything he does. It's not clear here whether this is a moral reason or just a natural reason. He doesn't really differentiate this. And if space and time were absolute, he says, God must arbitrarily have chosen where, when, and in which layout he created the world, since the point in time, the place in space would have existed, but without any internal differences. So the argument is like, there is space, say, and God must have put the world somewhere in this space that somehow exists independently of things. But this is totally arbitrary because this space is empty, right? And this cannot be, because then God would have done something for which there's no internal reason. And the conclusion is, therefore, space and time cannot be absolute because of the choice without reason scenario it creates for God's creation of the world. And so all of Leibniz's arguments that time and space are relative really boil down to this, like either to the godlike premise or to the God's creation premise. They're a bit complicated to understand, but this is sort of the basis of it. So I find that there are a few problems with Leibniz premises. And so for the first premise, can this concept of God be demonstrated or be proven? Or is this just a matter of belief, like a theological, religious belief? I can just say there is no God like that, and then time and space can be absolute. Then space and time could be differently eternal or immense or whatever than God is. So the way we talk about eternity is maybe a little bit different when it comes to space and when it comes to time. So there could be some form of separation. And then also, it is not demonstrated why God cannot be spatial or temporal, especially not if space and time are taken to be absolute. So a lot of people also in the period didn't really think that this is a problem, because if space is just this absolute thing, it can somehow be compared to God, or in some way or another, maybe attributed to God even. And then with the second premise, there are also some difficulties. I really want you to focus on the first 2 points, because these are like most close to us. Like my students always say, like, yeah, but you can just say the opposite. You don't really have a problem, right? You just have to say, I don't believe in this God, and then the whole argument is sort of done for. And then the second premise also has some problems. So the first one is the same. It's based on this concept of God, but how is it based in our knowledge? And then Leibniz's proof of the principle of sufficient reason is a natural reason and not a reason for an action. So Leibniz goes on to kind of prove why the principle of sufficient reason holds, and his proof is in the natural realm of experience, and it's really just a proof of causation. And this is my serial killer course versus good reason course explanation. So when we look for a serial killer, we look for some causal chains, right? Like what motivated this person, even if these are the darkest motivations possible. And we can speak of this as a reason. And then of a good reason, we think of something completely different. So in the case of this arbitrary choice, what reason is here really talked about, and in what way is a reason necessary, is kind of left open by Leibniz. And then is reason in either sense, like in the good reason sense or in the just causal sense, applicable to God's will in creation? So Kant really sort of contested this, and it really held in the history of philosophy in terms of, he's shown that the concept of causality and therefore the PSR is is only really applicable to the realm of possible experience and not to the concept of God. So these are like all the different problems sort of with Leibniz premises. So can we turn against Leibniz and towards Newton because there are all these problems? Well, Newton did not really say anything about what time and space as absolute beings are supposed to be, i.e. independent essential beings. And he did not deny the notion of relative space and time. So it doesn't really
interrupt you. You have 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So it doesn't really lead us forward. So I'm getting to Du Châtelet finally. So Emily Du Châtelet will come to argue, one, that space and time are merely an order of things, like Leibniz, and relative to them. Without the existence of things, space and time are nothing. And then secondly, that there is an absolute notion of space and time, our power of imagination, which is useful for the sciences and legitimate as this notion in our imaginations. So this is kind of the result. But she does much more than reconciliating Newton and Leibniz. She constructs her argument on space and time on completely different premises. And it is these premises which allowed her to come to the reconciliatory conclusion on space and time. And it's really novel in this era. So first of all, the nature of time and space themselves are in question for Du Châtelet, not their use for a physical expression of absolute motion or their compatibility with a set concept of God. She really questions what is time, what is space. And there's a dedicated chapter to both space and time in her main work, Institutions de Physique. And she addresses space and time as important topics themselves. So she says, the question of the nature of space is one of the most famous that has divided ancient and modern philosophers alike. And she argues that the question of the nature of space is most essential because of its influence on the most important truths of physics and metaphysics. And she's clear about this historical dispute on space and time. She's got this idea that you must not put yourself into a camp. You must not just say what one author says. You must really reason through this all by yourself. She writes here that there are these highly opposed definitions of space. Some have said space is nothing over and above things. It is a mental abstraction, an ideal being. It is nothing other than the order of things as they coexist, and there's nothing to space except bodies. Others have, on the contrary, maintained that space is an absolute being, real and distinct from the bodies it contains, that it is an intangible, penetrable extension, lacking solidity, the universal vessel that receives the bodies that are placed in it, in a word, a sort of immaterial and infinitely extended fluid in which bodies swim. The former group has put forward several metaphysical reasons in support of their opinion. The others put forward the idea of space that imagination is able to form, and they have supported this idea using many objections against the contrary opinion. The objections are taken from the phenomena, and above all, from the difficulty there is with bodies moving in the absolute plenum. And she does believe that there must be reasons for both sides' arguments, because otherwise they would have somehow, one side would have kind of lost or whatever. And that there must be something in the premise, and she considers these in the premises of these arguments. And then she really develops her own method. And she calls it an analysis of ideas and an investigation of the formation of ideas. And it's really interesting because in the first part of her chapters on space and time, Du Châtelet repeats both of Leibniz's premises, so the godlike premise and God's creation premise, and it's not really different to Leibniz. And she argues for Leibniz's conclusion that space and time are nothing but an order of things relative on the basis of these premises. But in both chapters, she then does not consider these premises or the explanation of space and time to be sufficient. And this is where her own explanation kicks in. and where she adds it. And so both chapters have a second part where her premises and her argumentation changes completely, and which she introduces distinctively. And they are the two sections, how she introduces her own investigation. And just to give you an idea of how this works, she says that we feel that once we consider two things as different, and when we distinguish them, the one from the other in our minds, we place one external to the other. Thus, everything that we consider to be different from us, we see as external to us. There are many examples of this. If in our imagination we represent to ourselves a structure that we have never seen before, we represent it as external to ourselves, even though we know well that the idea we have of it exists within us and that there's perhaps nothing of this structure existing external to our idea. So she really looked at how does our mind form the abstraction that is created in the notion of space and time themselves. Then she says, it follows from this that we cannot represent to ourselves several different things as being one without this resulting notion that is attached to this diversity and to this union of things, and this notion we call extension. And she goes on, since we represent to ourselves in extension several things that exist external to one another and are one through their union, all extension has parts that exist external to one another and are one. And once we represent to ourselves parts both diverse and unified, we have the idea of an extended being. And then she goes on to say, once we pay attention to this notion of extension, we perceive that the parts of extension, when considered abstractly and without taking into account either their limits or their shapes, and must not have any internal differences. They must be similar and differ only in number. For since in order to form the idea of extension, we consider only the plurality of things and their union from which their existence external to one another originates, and we exclude every determination. We can substitute one in the place of another without destroying these two determinations, the plurality and the unity. And so any two parts of extension can differ from each other only in being two and not one. And this is really how we form this notion of absolute space in our imagination. So all of extension must conceive of as being uniform, homogeneous, and having no internal determination that distinguishes one part from another, since if we place these parts howsoever we wish, the result will always be the same being, and that is how we arrive at the idea of absolute space, And when we have thus formed a being in our imagination from the diversity of the existence of several things and of their union, extension, which is this imaginary being, seems to us distinct from all that is real, from which we have separated by abstraction. So what I really want to show you is that she explains how our imagination forms this notion of space. And du Châtelet thus explains in her investigation of how we form the idea of space, that the idea of space is formed through an act of abstraction by mind, and that this abstraction is dependent upon the beings it is abstracted from, of course. She can thus explain that, one, we form an imaginary notion of absolute space and time in our power of imagination, that this imaginary notion of space as a uniform entity is utilizable for mathematics and physics or geometry as well. Three, that on epistemological premises, this notion of space is ontologically, i.e. in its being itself, dependent upon that which it was abstracted from, i.e. real beings, and that space is thus in its being an abstraction of the mind, and as this abstraction an order of things relative to and reliant upon real beings. And she then advances a parallel explanation of time, of the nature of time, and this is even more extensive. And in summary, I want to come to some concluding remarks. So according to du Châtelet, the mind forms in an act of abstraction, an abstract notion of extension and of succession, which is time and space respectively, space and time respectively. And this abstract notion of space and time is attributed to the power of the imagination and is as such applicable to science, geometry, and so on. Yet because this abstract notion comes about through an act of abstraction by our faculty, i.e. the mind, they are dependent upon that which they are abstracted from. Thus, space and time as abstract notions are relative to and dependent upon real beings and only express their order. In her investigation of the formation of our idea of space and her analysis of the idea of time, Du Châtelet explains what the faculty of the mind does in relationship to real beings. She explains how the idea of space and of time has to be understood on this basis. And this is really a newfound way to think about space and time. And it is not based on mathematical premises or religious premises alone, but on what it is that is entailed by our our own ideas of space and time. And she emphasizes that in philosophy, it has to be made clear and explained that the abstract notion of space and time as used in mathematics and physics is not a substance, i.e. a being subsisting by itself, independently of real beings. And she can explain why the Newtonians attribute immensity, eternity, etc. to this imaginary notion of absolute space, and why they make the mistake of attributing this to space as if space was a substance, and can really explain where they are coming from. Yeah, thank you.
Is the mic on?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.